Every afternoon, when the clock at Heiligenfeld Primary School strikes exactly 4:15 p.m., 9-year-old Elena Varga steps off the sky blue, paint-chipped bus at the corner of Albrechtstrasse, in the quiet southern suburb of St. Gallen. Her worn backpack, slung unevenly over one shoulder, causes her to lean slightly to the right as she walks. Elena always keeps her left hand hidden inside her long sleeve, regardless of whether the weather is warm or cold. She walks steadily along the uneven cobblestone path, the sidewalk cracked like tree roots, without speaking, without stopping, without looking back. The small roadside square, a patch of gray concrete wedged between 3-story, peeling buildings, has no slides, no swings, just a gnarled old elm tree, and weathered wooden benches arranged around it. It's not a park, nor a place meant for children, but Elena always walks past it as if it were a fixed point on her mental map. On the outermost bench to the left, beneath the sparse canopy of leaves, there is always a man sitting. He wears a thick wool coat, a hood pulled over his head, and old jeans marked with dried mud. Every day he sits there like a statue, never moving, never eating, never reaching out to ask for anything. No one in the neighborhood pays him any attention. Adults pass by without turning their heads. Children take detours. But Elena is different. From the very first time she saw him, she knew. He wasn't like other homeless people. He didn't carry a cardboard sign with a plea written on it. He didn't dig through trash bins. He never looked up at anyone, nor tried to attract pity. His silence held something sorrowful, but not pitiful. Since she was little, Elena had a special way of noticing what others overlooked. Her mother said she was too sensitive, while her father said she was as suspicious as a wildcat. But Elena knew she could see things people tried to hide. And there was something about this man that didn't scare her, only made her curious. One day, she stopped for a few seconds, stared at him. He didn't turn around. His eyes were fixed on some invisible space, like he was staring into a memory no one else could see. Then she moved on, still silent. But a question had started to form in her mind, small as a speck of dust in the sunset. Why is he there every day? And why does no one ask? That evening, as she returned to the rundown ground-floor apartment where her father sat with his 4th beer, eyes glued to the TV, Elena said nothing. She went to her room, closed the door, and sat at her desk, looking out through the chipped paint window pane. She didn't draw, didn't do her homework. She just thought about the man on the bench. And the next morning, she knew one thing for sure. That afternoon, she would go back. Not just to walk past. Wednesday. The sky was strangely clear, the sunlight slanting westward like a sharp blade cutting through dusty window panes. Elena sat on the edge of a chair in the small kitchen, her eyes following her father's every movement. Raymond Varga, a war veteran who had returned from the front more than a decade ago, slumped in a torn leather chair, a faded tank top draped loosely over his thin but still rugged frame. On the table was a half-finished beer can, next to it a TV remote wrapped in duct tape. The show he was watching was a reality program about police arrests, the kind Raymond liked because it required no thinking. He said nothing to Elena when she returned from school. He didn't ask what she learned today, whether she was happy or if she was hungry. Those questions had long since vanished from the grammar of their household. On the kitchen table, a paper bag of fresh bread from Franz and Daughters still gave off warmth. Elena tiptoed over and took a small ciabatta loaf, her hand darting quickly as if afraid of being caught. But Raymond didn't notice. He didn't even turn his head. She pulled out a napkin, carefully wrapped the bread, and tucked it between the pages of her dog-eared 4th-grade math book. Her hands trembled slightly, but her eyes were strangely calm. Elena didn't know why she was doing it. She hadn't planned it. She hadn't thought it through. It was just a feeling vague like a midday dream that the man on the bench might need the bread more than her father did. She slipped out of the house before her father could say anything or even think of saying anything. The door closed behind her softly like a breath. The square was eerily quiet that afternoon. The familiar popcorn vendor sat under her faded umbrella, eyes glued to her phone. A group of teenagers passed by, one of them kicking an empty soda can toward the pigeons, sending them scattering. Elena didn't flinch. She was used to things like that. She crossed the square as she always did, but this time she stopped. The man was still there. He didn't look up, didn't move. His body seemed to have merged with the bench as though he had grown roots. Elena stood directly in front of him, feet together. She took a deep breath, but her throat was dry. Her voice was barely a whisper. She cleared her throat and tried again, louder. I brought this for you, she said, then opened her backpack, pulled out the ciabatta wrapped in the napkin and held it up with both hands at chest level like offering a gift. The man looked up very slowly. His eyes were a pale gray, deep and still, like an ice-covered lake. His face didn't soften, nor did it frown. He simply looked, a look that made one feel truly seen. I thought you might be hungry, Elena continued. My mom says we shouldn't waste food. And you looked like you hadn't had lunch. The man accepted the bread. His hands were rough, his nails dusty, but his gesture was unexpectedly gentle, as if he feared breaking something more fragile than glass. Thank you, he said, his voice like an old radio just turned on after days of silence. Elena said nothing more. She didn't wait for a reaction, didn't seek praise. She turned away and walked steadily toward the opposite street. Under the streetlight that had just begun to glow faintly, the man remained motionless. But this time his gaze no longer drifted into empty space. He watched the little girl with the lopsided brown ponytail and the off-center backpack. And at her collar, a detail he hadn't noticed the day before was a faint purple mark like a dandelion petal that had been crushed. He gripped the bread more tightly. He was no longer hungry. The apartment was on the third floor of an old building on the outskirts of St. Gallen, no nameplate, no doorbell. The hallway smelled of rotting wood mixed with fresh paint, just enough renovation to prevent it from being condemned. The man entered, locking the door behind him with 3 clicks, then stood motionless in the dark without turning on the light. In his hand was the ciabatta still wrapped in the napkin. He placed it on the chipped wooden table, slowly, then removed his knit cap. His breath was steady, but his eyes were sharp as a razor. Gone was the vacant stare of a drifter. Henrik Voss, 42, German citizen, CEO of Voss and Wren Capital, a private investment firm managing hundreds of millions of euros, was once described by financial magazines with 2 words, reclusive and unpredictable. In finance circles, he was known as a quiet, ethical investor, someone who funded no grand events, cut no ribbons, but stood behind dozens of hospital renovations, school upgrades, and rehab centers across Eastern Europe. Those close to him called him a purposeful observer. Because every year, without warning, Henrik would disappear from the office for weeks or months. No explanations. No one knew where he went. No one asked, because when he returned, the deals he struck always exceeded expectations. Henrik called it an anonymous humanitarian experiment. He believed, if you want to understand society, sit in the place of the forgotten. Not as a philanthropist, but as an invisible man. That evening, in a nameless, cheap rental flat, he opened a laptop on the worn wooden desk. The screen displayed a private encrypted interface, an internal system accessible only to Henrik and his 2 tech assistants in Berlin. He opened a new file. Typed the header. Field note, case number 27, Varga, Elena 9. Below it, he typed each line as if afraid to miss a single detail. Location, Albrechtstrasse Square, near Franz and Daughter's Bakery. Encounter time, Wednesday, 16:22, girl approached, without hesitation, offered bread. Notable traits, did not seek reaction. Unafraid of contact. Physical sign, purple mark on left side of neck, approximate 4 centimeters in diameter. Voice, clear, not timid. Language simple, sincere. Henrik leaned back in his chair. The room was so silent he could hear a faint pop from the old power socket. Outside the window, dim yellow light fell over a row of dusty bicycles. But his mind was elsewhere. He thought of Elena's eyes, the eyes of a child who had chosen action, not reflexive pity. Eyes like a thin blade slicing through the mask he had worn his entire adult life. Henrik wasn't hungry. But he unwrapped the bread. Took a small bite. He ate because the girl had chosen to give it to him as an act of trust. Not of pity. Wednesday. The sky was strangely clear. The sunlight slanting westward like a sharp blade cutting through dusty window panes. Elena sat on the edge of a chair in the small kitchen, her eyes following her father's every movement. Raymond Varga, a war veteran who had returned from the front more than a decade ago, slumped in a torn leather chair, a faded tank top draped loosely over his thin but still rugged frame. On the table was a half-finished beer can. Next to it, a TV remote wrapped in duct tape. The show he was watching was a reality program about police arrests. The kind Raymond liked because it required no thinking. He said nothing to Elena when she returned from school. He didn't ask what she learned today, whether she was happy, or if she was hungry. Those questions had long since vanished from the grammar of their household. On the kitchen table, a paper bag of fresh bread from Franz and daughters still gave off warmth. Elena tiptoed over and took a small ciabatta loaf, her hand darting quickly, as if afraid of being caught. But Raymond didn't notice. He didn't even turn his head. She pulled out a napkin, carefully wrapped the bread, and tucked it between the pages of her dog-eared fourth-grade math book. Her hands trembled slightly, but her eyes were strangely calm. Elena didn't know why she was doing it. She hadn't planned it. She hadn't thought it through. It was just a feeling, vague like a midday dream, that the man on the bench might need the bread more than her father did. She slipped out of the house before her father could say anything, or even think of saying anything. The door closed behind her softly, like a breath. The square was eerily quiet that afternoon. The familiar popcorn vendor sat under her faded umbrella, eyes glued to her phone. A group of teenagers passed by, one of them kicking an empty soda can toward the pigeons, sending them scattering. Elena didn't flinch. She was used to things like that. She crossed the square as she always did. But this time she stopped. The man was still there. He didn't look up, didn't move. His body seemed to have merged with the bench, as though he had grown roots. Elena stood directly in front of him, feet together. She took a deep breath, but her throat was dry. Her voice was barely a whisper. She cleared her throat and tried again, louder. "I brought this for you," she said, then opened her backpack, pulled out the ciabatta wrapped in the napkin, and held it up with both hands at chest level, like offering a gift. The man looked up very slowly. His eyes were a pale gray, deep and still, like an ice-covered lake. His face didn't soften, nor did it frown. He simply looked, a look that made one feel truly seen. "I thought you might be hungry," Elena continued. "My mom says we shouldn't waste food. And you looked like you hadn't had lunch." The man accepted the bread. His hands were rough, his nails dusty. But his gesture was unexpectedly gentle, as if he feared breaking something more fragile than glass. "Thank you," he said. His voice like an old radio just turned on after days of silence. Elena said nothing more. She didn't wait for a reaction, didn't seek praise. She turned away and walked steadily toward the opposite street. Under the streetlight that had just begun to glow faintly, the man remained motionless. But this time, his gaze no longer drifted into empty space. He watched the little girl with the lopsided brown ponytail and the off-center backpack. And at her collar, a detail he hadn't noticed the day before, was a faint purple mark, like a dandelion petal that had been crushed. He gripped the bread more tightly. He was no longer hungry. The apartment was on the third floor of an old building on the outskirts of St. Gallen. No nameplate, no doorbell. The hallway smelled of rotting wood mixed with fresh paint. Just enough renovation to prevent it from being condemned. The man entered, locking the door behind him with 3 clicks, then stood motionless in the dark without turning on the light. In his hand was the ciabatta, still wrapped in the napkin. He placed it on the chipped wooden table slowly, then removed his knit cap. His breath was steady, but his eyes were sharp as a razor. Gone was the vacant stare of a drifter. Henrik Voss, 42, German citizen, CEO of Voss and Wren Capital, a private investment firm managing hundreds of millions of euros, was once described by financial magazines with 2 words: reclusive and unpredictable. In finance circles, he was known as a quiet ethical investor, someone who funded no grand events, cut no ribbons, but stood behind dozens of hospital renovations, school upgrades, and rehab centers across Eastern Europe. Those close to him called him a purposeful observer, because every year, without warning, Henrik would disappear from the office for weeks or months. No explanations. No one knew where he went. No one asked, because when he returned, the deals he struck always exceeded expectations. Henrik called it an anonymous humanitarian experiment. He believed, if you want to understand society, sit in the place of the forgotten, not as a philanthropist, but as an invisible man. That evening, in a nameless, cheap rental flat, he opened a laptop on the worn wooden desk. The screen displayed a private encrypted interface, an internal system accessible only to Henrik and his 2 tech assistants in Berlin. He opened a new file, typed the header, field note, case number 27, Varga, Elena, 9. Below it, he typed each line as if afraid to miss a single detail. Location: Albrechtstrasse Square, near Franz and Daughter's Bakery. Encounter time: Wednesday, 16:22. Girl approached, without hesitation, offered bread. Notable traits: did not seek reaction, unafraid of contact. Physical sign: purple mark on left side of neck, approximate 4 centimeters in diameter. Voice: clear, not timid. Language: simple, sincere. Henrik leaned back in his chair. The room was so silent he could hear a faint pop from the old power socket. Outside the window, dim yellow light fell over a row of dusty bicycles. But his mind was elsewhere. He thought of Elena's eyes, the eyes of a child who had chosen action, not reflexive pity. Eyes like a thin blade slicing through the mask he had worn his entire adult life. Henrik wasn't hungry, but he unwrapped the bread, took a small bite. He ate, because the girl had chosen to give it to him as an act of trust, not of pity. 2 days later, Friday afternoon. The wind was still and sunlight slanted through the bare branches above Albrechtstrasse Square. The popcorn vendor didn't show up. The old stone benches sat silent beneath the rust-tinted golden light. Henrik was already seated. His eyes scanned an old local newspaper, his hand keeping time with quiet patience. He didn't wait like a homeless man, he observed like someone relearning how to be patient. At exactly 4:16 p.m. Elena appeared from the opposite street. Her brown hair tied to one side. Her steps slower than usual. There was something cautious. As if today she had thought carefully before deciding to enter the square. Henrik folded the newspaper and placed it beside him. He didn't greet her. The girl said nothing either. She simply walked over and sat down, carefully leaving a gap the width of an adult's shoulders between them as if it was a safety distance she'd tested before. Several minutes passed in silence. Then Henrik pulled a small plastic container from his worn fabric backpack and placed it between them. I brought 2 apples. One for you if you'd like. Elena glanced at the box, then gave a small nod. For the first time, she accepted something from him. No one rushed to eat. No one felt obliged to speak. And maybe that was what made the meeting feel completely unforced. Henrik asked gently, "Do you like to draw?" Elena nodded. No surprise. No suspicion. Henrik pulled out a blank sketchbook and a small box of colored pencils. He had bought them that morning at a shop near the train station. "If you want. No pressure. It doesn't have to be pretty." "I can draw," the girl replied softly but clearly. She opened the sketchbook, chose a light black pencil. No hesitation. Her hand held the pencil as naturally as a spoon. Henrik didn't look at the paper. He watched the trees, the building across the square, the children walking home from school. Occasionally, he glanced sideways, saw Elena's hand moving steadily, quickly, but with certainty. 12 minutes later, she stopped. Without saying a word, she handed him the page. No trembling, but she didn't meet his eyes. Henrik took it. The page showed a narrow room with a single rectangular window barred with iron. On the floor was a broken-legged dining table, a toppled chair, and in the corner, a small girl curled tightly, head buried in her knees. To the left, a grown-up figure twice her size held something resembling a belt. Henrik stared at the drawing for a long time. He didn't ask. He didn't comment. In the bottom corner, written lightly in pencil, were 4 words. "Don't tell anyone." Henrik inhaled deeply. His throat was dry, but his voice remained calm and gentle. "Thank you for showing me." Elena didn't reply. She picked up her pencil and began drawing a new page. This one was only streaks, black lines, jagged and tangled, laced with red. Like blood spattered on a white wall. Henrik quietly opened his backpack, took out his phone, silently photographed the first 2 drawings, no sound, no flash. He knew he was stepping onto a fragile line between observation and intervention. That evening, after Elena left, Henrik didn't return to the apartment. He took a taxi to the city center to a small office he kept under a different name, reserved for off-the-record situations. There, he opened his laptop, pulled up the drawings, sent them via encrypted channel to a contact in Germany, Dr. Saskia Bauer, a child trauma therapist who had worked with war victims in Sarajevo. Less than 30 minutes later, her reply came. "Henrik, these are classic indicators of ongoing physical and psychological abuse. The withdrawn posture, the depiction of enclosed space and clear aggression. If this reflects her reality, the child is in silent danger. Henrik wasn't surprised. But the words silent danger echoed in his mind like thunder in the dark. He opened another file. Title: Varga, Raymond, Legal Status and Social Behavior. He would need more than drawings. He needed structure, documentation, expertise, and a plan that wouldn't cause a second kind of harm. That night, he typed a final line into his personal field log. When a child chooses silence, it's not always because they don't want to speak, but because the world has never learned to listen. Henrik Voss barely slept that night. He sat on a rickety wooden chair in the rented apartment, turning over the 2 drawings Elena had given him, the locked room and the figure of a man striking with a belt. Thin as school paper, but heavier than any financial report he had ever signed. At 5:37 a.m., Henrik put on a wool coat, took a sip of thick black coffee, and unlocked his phone. A short message was sent to the only 3 people he trusted for work outside of Enterprise. Activate. Target: Elena Varga, 9 years old. Collect: school, medical, legal. Absolute discretion. Within 2 minutes, all 3 replied. Received. By 9 a.m., Henrik met them in the attic of an old building on Oberstrasse, a space furnished only with chipped wooden desks and a window facing a gray wall. Marta Kepler, strategic aide, opened her laptop, waiting for orders. Dr. Saskia Bauer, child psychologist, placed a small leather case on the table. Vincent Arnaud, juvenile defense attorney, carried a thick folder of legal frameworks. Henrik got straight to the point. Elena showed signs of abuse. The drawings were just the beginning. He instructed Marta to investigate Elena's behavior at Heiligenfeld School, Saskia to devise a discreet medical examination, and Vincent to prepare the legal foundation for an emergency protection order. But only once the evidence was watertight. Too early, and Raymond Varga might retaliate. Too late, and Elena could vanish. 2 days later, Marta walked through the iron gate of Heiligenfeld School wearing a pale gray suit, introducing herself as a representative of the Kinderlicht Scholarship Fund. The principal, pleased, brought her to an office stacked with old gray books. Within an hour, Marta had discreetly scanned Elena's records: 6 unexcused absences, worn-out shoes, paint-stained uniform, and a teacher's note, lowers body when hearing loud male voice. She left the school with the documents hidden inside a slim folder and immediately sent the data to Henrik. Signs of noise avoidance, neglect, no parental presence at meetings. That afternoon at 4:15 p.m., Elena arrived at the square, looking tired. Henrik said nothing. He simply handed her a new box of colored pencils. After some light conversation, he said gently, "I know a doctor. She's nice, doesn't use needles, won't ask hard questions. You just need a health check for the scholarship. Would that be okay?" Elena bit her lip, then nodded. Henrik scheduled the visit for Friday morning at a private clinic in the city center. The day of the appointment, it drizzled. Elena, wearing a thin coat, walked beside Henrik into a pine-paneled clinic scented with soft disinfectant. Dr. Saskia greeted her like an aunt. "You're Elena? I'm just going to check your height, look at your eyes, and listen to your heartbeat. That's all, okay? No white lab coat, just a chestnut cardigan." In the warmth of the room, Elena's shoulders gradually relaxed. But when Saskia gently lifted her left sleeve, the girl flinched. Beneath the fabric was a bruise, yellowing, green around the edges. Saskia didn't press. She measured her pulse, then asked softly, "Have you ever hurt yourself from a fall?" Elena whispered, barely audible. "It only hurts when I do something wrong." The words hit the wooden floor like thin metal dropping. After 20 minutes, Saskia sealed a folded report in a waxed envelope and handed it to Henrik in the hallway. 3 recent bruises. 1 old, fading. Clear defensive reflex. Urgent intervention recommended. Henrik held the envelope. His fingers were ice cold despite the nearby radiator. That evening, in the Oberstrasse office, Vincent presented the completed report for Jugendamt: drawings, injury photographs, school reports, medical assessments. 1 signature from Henrik would be enough to file it. But Henrik placed the pen down. He calculated. If filed too early, an overwhelmed child services department might knock on Raymond's door, ask a few questions, then leave, and Elena would pay the price. If filed too late, she might disappear entirely. He said quietly, "We need the moment. The one where the file reaches the judge and she's already safe." That night, Henrik sat again on the usual bench in the square. The air was sharp. Elena arrived late, dark circles under her eyes. They barely spoke. Before leaving, she reached into her sweater pocket and pressed a folded paper into his hand. If I can't come anymore, please don't tell anyone." Then she darted across the cracked pavement and vanished behind the bakery corner. Henrik unfolded the note under the dim streetlight. For slanted purple words. "Don't let me disappear." He gripped the paper, pulse thudding in his temple. He stood, eyes fixed on the dark, silent street that led to her old apartment. He knew the countdown had begun. 3 days later, after Elena handed him the purple note with the fragile plea, Henrik still hadn't signed the Jugendamt report. Everything was ready. Drawings, expert assessments, confirmed bruises, school records, all in one neat folder, missing only a pen stroke. But Henrik hesitated. Not out of doubt, but because he knew one misstep could send Elena back into a room with no light, where no one even knew she had cried for help. And then a well-meaning but small act changed everything. Marta, acting on instinct and years of educational outreach, drafted a letter addressed to Elena's home. A simple message printed on white paper with the Kinderlicht logo, the fake nonprofit they had created to approach at-risk students. The letter read, "Congratulations, Elena Varga, student of Heiligenfeld Primary, has been selected as a potential scholarship recipient. You will receive books, study materials, and support to join creative extracurricular activities in the coming school year." At the bottom, a digital signature, a pale blue stamp. Marta hadn't asked Henrik first. When he read the copy, he paused, then nodded. "It's fine. At least she knows she's worth something." But they forgot one crucial detail. The letter didn't go to Elena. It went to the address in her father's name. Wednesday afternoon. The sky was dull, the air still. Henrik sat alone on the usual bench, arriving 10 minutes early as always, a new box of watercolor pens wrapped in craft paper in hand. By 5:15 p.m., no sign of brown hair. No familiar dragging footsteps. No hint Elena would come. Henrik felt his chest tighten, not with fear, but with the unmistakable collapse of something breaking beneath your feet, like a wooden bridge cracking one plank at a time. At 6:15, Henrik called Marta. Her voice was steady. But when he asked, she paused. "The letter was dropped in the mailbox yesterday. No one signed for it." Henrik said nothing. In his mind, a chain of possibilities ignited. Raymond opens the letter. Reads it. Realizes Elena has been in contact with outsiders. A man as silent as stone, but under stone there's always fire. Henrik ended the call. His eyes turned toward the street that led to her apartment. His chest felt as hollow as a stomach starved in winter. Elsewhere, in a suffocating ground floor flat, Elena lay curled on her bedroom floor. She hadn't turned on the light. The door was unlocked, but the handle was broken. Her left cheek swollen, bruised. The letter, crumpled in a corner, still bore the word scholarship near the edge. Raymond had not shouted. He hadn't hit hard. He had walked into the room, stared at Elena as if she were a cracked object, and asked, in a voice dry as dust, "What did you tell them?" Elena didn't answer. She shook her head, hugging her knees. Then came the slap. Not hard enough to bleed, but enough to send her head into the table's edge. Later, he unplugged the TV cable. Coiled it. Placed it on the table, not using it, just placing it. Colder than any blow. That night, 8:43 p.m., Henrik received a text from an unknown number. A public phone. "I can't come out. Don't come. Don't let Dad see. I'm okay." No name. No emoji. But Henrik knew who sent it. He stared at the screen, a silent fury rising in him. Not the kind that shouted, but the kind born from seeing wrong and being forced to wait for protocol to fix it. He called Vincent. His voice was deep, even. "Send it. That's enough. No more waiting." At 9:10 p.m., the emergency file was submitted electronically to Jugendamt and the family court. A request to protect a minor within 24 hours. A proposal to inspect Raymond Varga's living conditions and temporarily remove Elena from the residence. Attached. The drawings. Medical notes. School reports. Copy of the anonymous text. All encrypted orderly by the book. Henrik signed it as non-relative witness with direct emotional link. The next morning at 8:06 a.m., a gray civilian vehicle stopped outside the ground floor apartment. 3 Jugendamt staff and 1 plainclothes officer knocked on the door. Henrik didn't go with them. He sat in a separate car a block away, eyes locked on the rearview mirror. He saw nothing, heard nothing. But at 8:18, the front door opened. A young woman stepped out carrying a small girl in a thin coat, clutching an old sketchbook to her chest. The girl didn't cry, didn't resist. She turned her head once to look down the street where Henrik waited. Through fogged glass, Henrik saw clearly. Elena didn't wave. She didn't smile. But her eyes lit with a tiny gleam, a thread-thin glimmer of light. Real. And in that moment, Henrik knew. He had arrived not as a savior, not as a substitute, but simply as the one who finally listened. When no one else had ever stopped long enough to hear. Elena Varga was taken to a temporary foster center on the southern outskirts of the city, an old but spotless two-story house tucked among green chestnut trees. There was no big iron gate, no security cameras, no bold sign. Everything was kept deliberately simple, as if to reassure children who had lost all sense of safety. Her room was on the top floor, cream-colored walls, a window overlooking the back garden where a wooden swing hung from a low branch. Inside were only a small bed, a desk, and a pale gray fabric wardrobe. On the first day, Elena said nothing. She sat on the bed, clutching her old sketchbook, fingers trembling as she turned each page, as though every drawing exposed a secret. She ate little, slept fitfully, and flinched whenever she heard footsteps in the hallway. Her temporary guardian, Marianne, a patient, soft-spoken woman in her 40s, asked her nothing. Each night she left a cup of warm milk and a simple note: "If you want to talk, I'll be outside the door." Henrik did not visit right away. He knew the first phase was for Elena to map out the new space for herself, free from any familiar shadow, including the man she had once trusted. But he stayed close. For a week after her removal from Raymond, Henrik worked from a rented flat on the nearby hill, just a 10-minute walk from the center. Every morning he sent a small envelope through Marianne, a new pad of drawing paper, a charcoal pencil, sometimes a blue pebble from the lakeshore, or a short handwritten note. No pep talks. No coaxing. Just small proofs of presence. Elena responded after 3 days, not with words but through action. She returned a watercolor sheet quite unlike her previous drawings: no towering man, no barred room. Instead, a little bridge over a stream and a girl standing alone at its entrance, facing the light. The sun was still pale yellow, but this time it was round enough to be a real sun. Marian carefully slipped the picture into an envelope and handed it to Henrik the next morning. Sitting in the small park behind the center, his hands trembled as he opened it. For the first time in years, Henrik felt something he thought he had lost: gratitude. Not for having done the right thing, but because a child still had strength to paint the sun again. On the 8th day, Elena agreed to see Henrik. They met in a room with wide windows and pale blue cushions. She wore a long-sleeved sweater, her hair tied neatly at the nape. Stepping inside, she paused for a second as if measuring the distance, then sat on the chair opposite him. No one spoke for the first 5 minutes. Henrik had brought no gifts, no paper. He only smiled faintly. Elena spoke first, in a near whisper. "I don't have nightmares anymore." Henrik nodded. He did not ask about bruises or the old house. Instead he said, "Would you like to draw something new?" Elena shook her head, then murmured, "I want to learn how to be a lion. Not to bite anyone, just so I'm not afraid of the roar anymore." Henrik laughed, truly laughed, for the first time in this whole journey. "I'll find someone to teach you how," he promised. A lion who can keep itself safe without needing to roar. The visit ended after 30 minutes. As Elena left, she turned and said very softly, "I know you're not a hero, but you have good ears." Like a soft chair people don't notice is holding their back. Henrik remained in the room, silent. Outside the window, early spring sunlight fell across the grass. He opened his notebook and wrote a single line: "No one is born knowing what safety is, but it can be learned." That evening he scheduled a meeting with Dr. Bauer to design a long-term therapy plan for Elena, combining art and emotional communication. Then he asked Marta to prepare papers for private guardianship funding in case Elena could not return to her mother or lacked suitable relatives. Henrik had no intention of adopting Elena. But he would be an anchor point, not a chain, but a stone in midstream, for the girl to step on if she chose, or simply to know it was always there. On the 10th day, Marianne found a new drawing on Elena's desk, a lion lying under a tree, not roaring, not snarling, merely sleeping, its tail draped over its eyes. On the branch above, a small blue bird peered down. Behind the lion sat a man in a knit cap, reading a book. The picture was folded neatly into a white envelope. On the outside, Elena had written, "I think the lion is me. And you're its chair." 1 week after Elena was moved to the foster center, Henrik received a call from Vincent Arno. Vincent's voice was steady and measured as always, but this time it held something different, a slight hesitation, like he was unsure whether what he was about to say should be said at all. "I found a trace of Elena's mother." Henrik didn't answer immediately. He was seated by the window, notebook open, pen resting across a blank page. He waited for Vincent to continue. "Her full name is Lucia Varga née Muller. She left her registered address in Street Jacob 3 years ago. No contact left behind. No divorce filed. No death certificate, no updated residency records. But she was admitted to the emergency room in Basel 14 months ago. She used her maiden name. Henrik frowned slightly. A hidden file. A woman who'd vanished from the system without explanation. And left behind a child. A mother who could disappear without a trace and no one came looking? He closed the notebook. I need to know more. Why she left. And if she knows what's happened to Elena. Vincent promised to dig further. That night, Henrik couldn't sleep. In his mind was the image of a faceless woman, just the silhouette of someone sitting behind a door, holding a child, then letting go, stepping over a threshold, never returning. He wasn't angry. He just felt a void, not of loss, but of questions no one had ever answered. The next morning, Henrik arrived at the foster center earlier than usual. Marianne met him at the gate. Elena wants to talk. But this time, not just about dreams. In the small counseling room, Elena was already seated, holding a folded sheet of paper, no sketchpad, no colors. She looked at Henrik for a long moment before speaking. I miss my mom. A simple sentence. Plain. Not choked with emotion. Henrik nodded. Can you tell me something about her? Elena was silent for a while. Then slowly unfolded the paper. On it was a hand-drawn map, simple but clear, a small kitchen, a table with a red polka-dot cloth, a steaming teacup, and an empty chair across from it. She pointed at the chair. I always kept that chair for her. Every night, before bed, I imagined she would sit there just once more. Henrik said nothing. A child who no longer remembers her mother's face but still leaves a chair unoccupied, that's the deepest kind of missing. Do you know where she went? He asked gently. Elena shook her head. Dad said she was weak. Didn't know how to be a grown-up. Didn't know how to raise a child. He said she left because I was a burden. A heavy silence fell, like old paint cracking off the walls. Henrik wanted to say something, to tell her no child is a burden. But he knew, denying too quickly only deepens the doubt. He placed his hand on the table, leaving enough space so she wouldn't feel pressured to reach for it. Do you believe that? He asked, softly. Elena looked up. Her eyes weren't wet, but held something cloudy and still, like the bottom of a lake where no wind reaches. I used to believe it. But now, I think if she held me when I had a fever, told me stories at night, maybe she didn't leave because of me. Maybe she left because she didn't know any other way. Henrik felt his throat tighten. That wasn't forgiveness. And it wasn't blame. It was a sapling growing from wreckage. He nodded slowly. Do you want to find her? Elena thought for a moment, then nodded. But she didn't say yes. She asked instead, what if she doesn't want to see me? Henrik replied in the voice he used when writing in his journal. Then at least you'll know she's alive. And you'll know you were brave enough to look. That afternoon, Henrik went straight to Vincent's office. New documents were waiting on the desk. Lucia had once worked a short stint at a cafe near Basel station, then vanished. There were rumors she crossed the border into Strasbourg, but no valid residency record. Henrik knew these fragments could take weeks, even months, to assemble. But this time he wasn't alone. Elena had started remembering. And in those memories, the empty chair was no longer proof of abandonment, but a space of waiting, warm, persistent enough to hope someone might return. On the train ride back to the foster center, Henrik opened his notebook and wrote, Some people don't leave because they want to. They leave because they don't know how to stay when they're lost themselves. The search for Lucia Varga began with a blurry name in the system, a 7-year-old ID photo, and a former rental address on the Swiss-French border. Henrik didn't expect to find her within weeks. He had once traced cross-border financial fraud faster than this. But finding someone like Lucia, someone not running from the law, not seeking attention, was different. People like her didn't hide. They simply faded. Marta helped Henrik contact an international NGO supporting women who had fled abusive relationships. Of 13 centers along the border, 3 had reported, in 2022, a woman named Muller, no papers, no children. The profile partially matched. Henrik read each intake report carefully, heart tightening when he saw one note in the margin. Refuses to speak of her child, repeats, I'm not fit to be a mother. Henrik sat still for a full hour after reading that line. He thought of Elena, a girl who had kept an empty chair for 3 years, who once believed she was the reason her mother left, who drew her father in pictures as a faceless shadow. And now he was reading the echo of that very belief from the mother's side. He didn't blame Lucia. Didn't condemn her. He just felt sorrow. Like watching 2 people lost in fog, each thinking they were the one left behind. A few weeks later, on a rainy afternoon, Henrik's phone rang. Vincent's voice was quiet. A woman claiming to be Lucia just showed up at a small church outside Strasbourg. She came with a nun. No ID. But when she heard Elena's name, she collapsed. Henrik said nothing for 3 seconds. Then, Does she want to see her? Vincent paused. She says she doesn't dare. That day, Henrik didn't go to the foster center. He went straight to Strasbourg and waited for hours outside the church tucked behind a cobbled street. Eventually, she stepped out, thin frame, sloping shoulders, unevenly cropped hair. Nothing like the old photo? But the eyes were right, eyes that had once held a newborn and not slept for 3 nights. Henrik didn't introduce himself. He simply sat across from her on a stone bench and said softly, "I didn't come to ask you to do anything. I just came to tell you Elena is still waiting." Lucia looked at him, eyes wide and searching, as if hoping to find in him something to hold on to. She whispered, "I broke her. I left her with a monster." Henrik didn't reply at once. There were no words that could soften that truth. Finally, he said, "I don't know if Elena needs her mother to survive, but I do know she lived so that she might meet her again one day. You have the right not to come back, but you also have the right to return, not to fix, just to be there." Lucia didn't cry. She just clasped her hands and sat still. 10 minutes passed. 15. Then she said, "I'll go. But I'm not promising anything." Henrik nodded. "You don't have to promise. Just take the first step." 3 days later, on a crisp morning, Elena was painting, 2 hands touching through a window pane when Marianne walked in. "You have a visitor. But you don't have to meet her if you don't want to." Elena put down her brush. She didn't ask who. She simply said, "I think I know." When Lucia stepped into the little art room, she stopped at the doorway. Elena looked up. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. Then Elena said calmly, "I used to keep a chair for Mom. Now I sit in it myself. But if you'd like, there's still a chair across from mine." Lucia stepped forward. But she didn't sit. She knelt before her daughter, hands resting on the table edge, head bowed. "I'm not here to ask for forgiveness. I just want to know, did you grow up?" Elena nodded gently. "I'm still growing. But not always alone." No one cried. No dramatic reunions. Just a mother learning how to return and a child learning how to let her in. Henrik stood outside. He didn't enter. He only watched through the slightly open door and exhaled softly, like someone finally putting down a burden carried too long without a name. 11 weeks after Elena was taken from Raymond Varga's apartment, she returned with Henrik to Albrechtstrasse Square, the long bench across from Franz and Daughter's bakery, where their story began with a loaf of bread and an unexpected act that changed them both. Henrik arrived first, as always, in his dark wool coat, a slim book tucked under his arm. He sat on the same old bench, the one with the worn backrest, the same spot he'd occupied all winter, hiding in plain sight like a stranger in a noisy city. This time, he came not to observe, not to intervene, not to save. He came simply to be there. Elena arrived later. She wore a cream wool sweater, canvas shoes worn at the heels but clean, hair tied to one side as always. She walked slowly, without hesitation. No one brought her there. She had chosen to come. She sat beside him without waiting for an invitation. Didn't ask why they were here. Henrik didn't explain. They just looked out at the square. Bicycles passing, children chasing one another after school, the bakery bell chiming as people came and went. Elena pulled a piece of cake from her pocket, not bread. For the first time, it wasn't something she brought for someone else. She ate slowly, then turned to Henrik. "You know," she said, "I think quiet adults still have voices. They just speak a different way." Henrik tilted his head, smiling. "Where did you learn that?" Elena shrugged, paused, then pointed at herself. "From having to be quiet for a very long time." They stayed quiet, but it was no longer the silence of fear or doubt. It was the calm of people who no longer needed many words to know they'd walked far together. Henrik placed a small sheet of paper on her lap. 3 neat lines in black ink. 3-month art therapy scholarship. Sponsor, anonymous. Location, Blauenhaus Children's Institute, Lucerne. Elena read it without asking questions. She raised an eyebrow. 3 months. Then what? Henrik looked up at the pale gray sky above the church steeple. "Then you'll know where you want to go. And if you want to come back, I'll still be here, Wednesday, for a clock, like always." Elena nodded. Not grateful, not resistant. She simply looked at the bench, then asked like an adult, "And you? Where will you go?" Henrik smiled, a rare smile that broke past his usual stillness. "I don't know. Maybe I'll sit in another square, watch someone else. Or maybe I'll try living without needing to disappear. Elena was quiet for a long time. Then she turned to him, asking her final question. Do you still think of yourself as an observer? Henrik didn't answer immediately. He looked into her eyes, once so dark, now touched by a clear, pale green. Not bright, but the kind of light that never fully fades. Maybe. Now I just want to be someone who sits beside. Elena smiled, truly smiled, for the first time. Not guarded, not cautious. She broke off a final piece of her cake and placed it in Henrik's hand. Then you get the last piece. To make it fair. Around them, the city moved on as always. No one paused. No one looked at the two on the bench. But in that small corner of the world, between two people, unrelated by blood, connected only by choice, something had been exchanged. Not with words, not by duty, but by presence. A seat, a glance, a shared moment. And sometimes that's enough. Enough for a child to believe in life again.